this? I am so close to this answer. Is this thing? There it goes. See, this is what's so weird to me. What is choice? What is openness? What is freedom? What is independence? What is liberty? Because, I can define all that stuff negatively by saying what it isn't. Independence is just the lack of dependence. Freedom is the lack of constraint or obstruction. Possibility is the lack of impossibility. But see, this is where the crux of the whole thing goes. This is the central axiom. So this is where I draw the line and I say, I can't define what that is. All I can do is I can assert it into my theory, and I can say there is possibility, there is choice, there is freedom, there is liberty, there is independence. I can say that, but I can't tell you what that is. Now, that's Deus Ex Machina. Lucidity says the reason that I have independence, the reason that I have freedom, the reason that I have the capacity and the depth to make choices, which is ultimately what I am, is the one who makes the choice. Right? That's who I am. Lucidity says that God gives me that. That I get that from God because without that, God has no one else. God just has God. So it's sort of an artificial reduction. It's sort of an oversimplification. But basically what that's saying is without each other, we have nothing. Even God gets lonely. Even God would rather have us than have no one. Because even though God is perfect, even though everything about God is perfect, even though God was perfectly happy without us being there before we existed, God still chose to create us. Even though we're sinners, even though we're disgusting, evil little creatures, even though we have no ability to ever be grateful enough to God to pay for our own existence. Nothing that we could ever hope to ever do would ever pay for all the pain and anguish and annoyance and disappointment and confusion and bewilderment and possibly even disdain, maybe even wrath of God that we have by our nature de facto forced upon God by our nature, by our own darkness, by our own finitude. We must sin. We cannot ever stop sinning, ever. Why then would God have chosen to do this? I believe God chose to do this because there's something intrinsically valuable about relations. So that ties all of it into one thing. I value relations, which then means that I value information because information is itself a relation. So the field of relativity is what I'm getting at, that I say is intrinsically valuable. And I say that is why God chose to create us, is so that there would be a relation between us and God. That's for lucidity. That's the lucid explanation. And I love that, the lucid explanation, because that's what it is, because you awaken to relativity, which is logical validity, and you integrate everything into a massive theory or paradigm that explains all of it. And it does so eloquently, so compoundingly that I don't think that there could be a better explanation than that for me. Is that the only explanation? Of course not. God infinitely values not just the field of relativity, but also the field of subjectivity, the field of objectivity, the totality of all the dimensions themselves, plus all the reference that are inside of them, all of it. So equally. So that's one piece that I have. And even that, I still don't value even that as much as God does. I just value it more than I value anything else. But that doesn't mean that I value it more than anyone else. Other people value it more than I do. Other people have Einstein, Newton, Kant, There's Nietzsche. There's probably a whole slew that possibly cared way more than me about the field of relativity. I don't know. I can't compare that. But I do know that it makes perfect sense to me. So we've got God, who's a perfect entity. Why would he create an imperfect entity? Well, because he wanted someone to relate to. He wanted someone else there, even if the other person was less than him. It's better than nothing. It's better than just hanging out by yourself, even though God is God's own best companion because he's perfect. He's basking in his own sunlight over here. But for how long can you do that before it becomes pointless? What is the point of that? If that was the only thing God ever did, he'd be a hedonist, only seeking his own pleasure. Well, the maximization of God's own pleasure would have been to never create us and just sit around and bask in his own rays of perfection, just checking himself out all day long in the mirror. Ooh, damn, look at me. And that's all he does all day long. I mean, like I said, I could see me doing that for a while. I'm pretty vain. I could stand in that mirror for a good hot minute, but eventually I'd be like, okay, you know what? I've seen enough. I've already seen myself. I already know myself. I already know. I'm not surprised. There's nothing new. There's nothing novel. And that gets into more of a Terence McKenna kind of a bent, where it's, that existence is a novelty generating machine. And the reason that God created us was because we were new. We were something else. We were something that didn't exist before, that was this grand experiment. And so you might have that view. There's all kinds of ways of looking at it. And I think each of these is a little piece of the broken vase. And I call it the broken vase because it's like, it always reminds me of that scene in The Matrix where Neo goes into the Oracle's room and she says, hey, don't worry about the vase. And he goes, what vase? And he looks around and he hits the vase and it falls over and shatters. And she goes, that vase. and then she finishes it off, puts the star on top by saying, well, what's really going to bake your noodle is, would you still have broken it if I hadn't said anything? And that fucking gets me, dude. I love that line. That's so cool. So I always refer back to that. That's probably my favorite scene in The Matrix, is the scene where Neo breaks the vase. Because I envision that that's kind of how we began, where, it's me, it's us and God. It's, the very first primordial person and God. And me being male, I like to think of it as Adam, but whatever. So you've got the primordial person and God. And God says to him, hey, you know what? Don't worry about that vase, man. And he looks around and he goes, what vase? And he breaks it. And God goes, that vase. And then so here we are. And so now all we have are all these little broken pieces, but God's whole thing is, hey, don't worry about it. And, then it's like, well, then why'd you say to do that? Why would you do this? This is madness. How dare you? But, and I kind of like that view that there's some mischief in existence, at least a little bit, because I think that God appreciates a little irony personally, but I don't know. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know, but I would think anyone that ran the universe would have to have a sense of irony in order to run it well, man. Or else you're going to blow your brains out. Unless you find, at least a little bit of humor and some mischief, I don't think you're going to make it. But anyway, so that explains the whole thing right there for lucidity. Now, for the theory, for Deus Ex Machina theory, we got to cut God out. Because remember, I have to make a legal system, and therefore it can't have any religious dogma in it. Because all that stuff that I just said about God, nobody can prove that. Now, while it might make sense to me that God created existence so that it could sustain the two-reference system of relativity in the first dimension, and that was the only reason that God ever created anything, that's a bit much. But it's the lucid explanation. It means that God created us to examine and to get close to God and relate to God, and it's very idealistic. It's romantic, and in every sense, really. And that's why I like it. I think it's the best explanation for me. But like I said, Terence McKenna thought that this whole thing was all about novelty generation and the surprise, and Alan Watts was the same way, actually. He thought the same thing, that it was all about, well, imagine that you could dream about anything that you would ever want to dream. That you could do anything, you could have anything, you could be anyone. And, after so many nights of that, eventually you would dream that you weren't in charge, and you would dream for a surprise. You would dream about something that you can't even imagine currently. And that would be the most interesting dream, because now you're not in control. Now you don't know what's going to happen. And that's the whole point. Again, novelty. And so it's like, there's a few ways of looking at that. You can look at it a few ways. I don't look at it like that, because I've always believed that God knows everything. Now, while that has its own weird snags, it's a bent. It's a particular way of bending everything so that it closes, so that I can grasp it. If it's left the way it really is, it's so open and so amorphous, and like Alan Watts puts it, so wiggly, that I can't put my finger on it. I have no idea what the hell it really is. So if I do say it is anything, then I have to close it off, and that truncates it. And so that truncation then kind of distorts the image, and that's why the image can never be what it actually is. What it actually is at least one referent more complex than any image that I can render about it, because whatever information that I have about it is necessarily dependent on it existing before the information does. Because I can't have information about X if X doesn't exist. If there is no X, then I can't even have X as a symbol in order to reference it. It can't even be a referent, and therefore there can't be any information about it. So the referent is beyond the information. So the dimensions are describing the informational field, and the referent is what that informational field is about. So when we talk about the zeroth dimension, the referent of that zeroth dimension is the soul, or the subject. It's a subjective, not object, but center of focus. It's a subjective center of focus. You're focusing on something subjective when you're in a one reference system, which is in the zeroth dimension. And the reason that we have the zeroth dimension is because there's zero information about it, because information is relative, which means that you have to have at least two referents. In order to have information, you have to have the referent, and then you have to have the information about the referent. The explanation of the cause, not just the cause naked itself, like God is, basically. And as we are, as subjects, no information can or will ever exist about the zeroth dimension that has not been artificially extended into the first dimension. Because when I have information about a subject, then the information is fuzzy, because it's about a subject, which is smaller than a two-reference system. So when I reference a two-reference system, then I just copy and paste. And same thing with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to infinity. But the only dimension that I can't do it with is the zeroth dimension. And that's the one that I focus almost exclusively on. I love the zeroth dimension. And I also get really scared of it, because I wouldn't say that I've ever found it irritating, but I do find it scary. But it's fascinating. And that's because I can't really have any information about it. I can only have information about how I relate to it. So the way that my relation is to that subject is also going to determine the bent information that I get about them, or the blurriness of the information that I get about them. It's going to alter it. So if I look at you as my friend, I'm going to have a positive outlook on you. But if I look at you as my enemy, I'm going to have a negative outlook on you, irregardless of what you do. Doesn't actually even have anything to do with you. It has to do with my relation to you. So I don't ever get information about you. I get information about how I relate to you. The subject that I have, myself, and the subject that you have, yourself, have to relate to each other first before I have any information about you. And that makes perfect sense, because if I've never met you before, then I obviously can't know anything about you. But the moment that I do meet you, then I have the chance to actually relate to you. And then the more I relate to you, the more I know about you. The less that I relate to you, the less I know about you. And that's why when people talk shit about people that they don't like, either they know what they're talking about and they have related to this person quite a few times, which is rare. That's usually a rival, usually like a rival in your career or something like that, a contestant to what your position is. It could even be a formal, professional opponent in a debate where you are actively attempting to understand and relate to this person. But if I don't relate to you, if I say, I can't relate, then I don't have any information about you. I have nothing that I can say. I don't know, because I don't know what it's like to walk around in your shoes. I can't even find them. I cannot find your shoes to walk a mile in them. I can't walk a mile in your shoes because I don't even know where they are. I have no information about you until or unless I can find your shoes and I walk around in them. The more I walk around in them, the more I know about you. And that's the only way that I can know about you, is through my relation to you. And that is the only information that I'm getting, is not actually about you. It's about how I relate to you. And that's the only information that I'll ever have about anything. Even myself. The information that I have about myself is actually just information about how I relate to myself. It's my self-relation that I'm learning about. Now, I kind of tangentially learn about myself because I'm included in that relation. So if I take enough of those relations with enough of their states, enough of their consequences together to form a vast data space of all those examples, then I can have a more approximate, greater resolution, clearer image of myself, but I still never have direct clarification on myself. It's kind of like trying to stare into your own eye. I can use a mirror and I can look into my reflection's eye, but I can never look into my own eye. And that's all I have. I can look into the mirror and I can find my reflection, but I cannot find myself. I can only find my reflection. And so, and that's how everyone is. Everyone is in that state all the time for that reason. And it cannot be any other way. That's the only way that it could ever be. And thank God that it is, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. We would not exist. There would just be God, or there would just be nothing, depending on which, if you want to have a lucid or Deus Ex Machina view of it. And, or a nihilistic view, I should say, because Deus Ex Machina doesn't actually even take that. It doesn't say that there was nothing. It just says that we don't know what it is. It takes indiscernibility and extends it out there, because we don't know. It could be nothing. It could be something. It could be everything. I don't know. But whatever it is, I don't know what it is. So all of that is to say that who I am ultimately, I learn about by relating to myself and by relating to others, because I'm also included in every relation that I have with everyone else too. In fact, that's a lot better. You still need your self-relation. You still need introspection, but you also really need external relations with other people, because that's so diverse, because it's the self relating to an other that's totally independent. So that relation is going to be wider, it's going to be weirder, it's going to be more novel than any relation to the self that you could ever have. You can only have so many ways to relate to yourself. Either you like yourself or you don't. But when it comes to other people, the nuance and the subtlety and the surprise and the novelty and the weirdness of all these other relations that you have with other people tell you so much more about yourself than you could ever learn just by looking at yourself in isolation. And the reason is obvious. It's because when you have a self and then a self-relation, which is introspection, when you relate to that, there's very little room to move around in. It's a very narrow gap. It's the self relating to the self, and then it's the self relating to that self relation. And that's introspection. And so there really isn't very much room because there's too many of the self in that. So they're all too tight together. So it's a very tight, very narrow little gap that you're trying to use to discern. And an analogy would be like using parallax versus using a telescope. So if you've only got that one range of vision, it's really difficult to tell if there's just something in the lens, if there's just some reason that the light happened to refract in such a way on that specific area, versus parallax, where you've got thousands, maybe tens of thousands of units of distance in between those telescopes. And then you relate them back to each other and build a composite image. That's a hell of a lot clearer than anything that you could get just by looking at things from one direction, because you just don't have as much information. Analogously, you could even close one of your eyes and then you lose depth perception, kind of a thing. So if you want depth perception, you got to talk to other people. If you don't talk to other people, you won't have enough depth. You won't have a wide enough gap to be able to tell very much about yourself. But that's not to say that you should never relate to yourself. Obviously, you should. But it should be at least balanced with your relations with other people, so that you can widen your understanding of yourself. You'll have a much richer understanding of yourself if you do both than if you were to just do one or the other. So all of that is to say that ultimately I, like everyone else, am openness, because it's the openness that allows me to choose, because that's what a choice is. It's the ability to choose between multiple things. And so you have to have a multitude of things, and you also have to have a person to choose from them. And you have to have awareness in order to make a choice. And you have to have, most of all, independence to be able to make that choice, the power to be able to make that choice. If you don't have independence, then your choice really doesn't matter. It's kind of like then a preference. It's like, well, in an ideal world, I wish that I could have $1 million. That's what I would prefer, but I can't choose to have $1 million because I'm not independent enough to actually go out and get it. Now, if I become independent enough, independently wealthy, great, then I have that. But if I don't ever become independent, then I don't become independently wealthy, and then I don't have $1 million. It's just something that I wish for. I'd prefer it, but I can't choose it because I'm not independent enough to make that choice actually happen. So choice has independence as part of it. To be able to make a choice, you have to be independent enough to be able to actually make that choice. So for yourself, regardless of what anyone else is saying or doing. So what is that independence? I mean, it's not randomness, because randomness is unintentional. It is not, it's the only thing that is consistent about randomness is that it is inconsistent. But we aren't like that. We have consistencies that are greater than just the consistency of being inconsistent. There's more to us than that. So it isn't reducible to randomness. Independence is something that it's the opposite of dependence, and dependence is where you can predict and you can have certainty about the state of the one by knowing the state of the other, the cause or the independent variable. So if we've got an independent variable A and a dependent variable B, A causes B, B is the effect, and we know that we can predict B as long as we have the presence of A. We know that B will be present also because A causes B. So if we have A, then we must have B. So there's a way of determining dependence that way. So if that's how we measure dependence, then independence would be the exact opposite of that, which means that if I have A, I don't necessarily have B. That means that there's a resistance to the change that might happen, that there could be a cause present, but that the effect is interrupted, or even the cause is isolated. or prevented or something like that. I would say an independent life form is different from a dependent machine in the sense that just because there's food present doesn't necessitate that the life form will necessarily go directly for that food or a tractor or whatever. Versus an object, if I were to pick up an object and then release it, it will fall to the ground, to the most gravitationally stable position that it can, closest to the center of mass in whose gravity well it is stuck currently. So the independence would be the opposite of that. So that means that if I were to be picked up and placed somewhere, I would not necessarily fall. I would have some subjective, because now we're going to have to use subjective metaphor here, because I'm a subject, not an object. If you pick up my body and you release it, it will fall. My body will fall. If you pick up my mind and you release it, it may not fall. And if you pick up my soul and you release it, it may not fall. But if you pick up my body and you release it, it will fall. And so my body is dependent, and that makes sense because it reflects being, which has the absolute traits of absolute dependence, which we just proved it is, and absolute integration and absolute interactivity, of which the body is most definitely those. Now, it isn't in an absolute form, of course. It's a relativistic image or reflection of the absolute of being, but the body does definitely depend upon the mind and the soul to tell it what to do, because I'm proving it right now. And that's kind of what we get stuck with is, what is that proof? What is this? What is this that we're doing here? What is this? That's what I'm trying to define. This is freedom. And freedom is the resistance to dependencies on the others in one's environment. So that just by knowing the state of the other, you don't automatically know the state of the one, the self, whatever. There's an inability to predict, but it's not random, because random is a reflection of I. It's a reflection of indiscernibility. It is consistently inconsistent. It's a paradox. It's globally static, but it's locally fluctuating, because you can always tell randomness. There's white noise, for example. You can always recognize that. That is never confused with a song. It doesn't ever claim to have a beat, structure, or any notes or melodies. It's just flat noise. So it's consistent and it has a globally static form. White noise is something that you can always pick up on, but it's locally fluctuating because it's fuzzy sounding. It sounds like it's locally fluctuating, but globally static. I don't know of any other way of explaining that one. And then for the subject, which is reflective of nothing, which is to say that at its lowest point, literally nothing, that's nihilism. At its highest point, the opposite of nothing, which is to say that it is not comparable to anything. That the comparison cannot be made, so it has no equal. Not that it's equal to nothing, but that it has no equal. But both of them are equally valid rationally in relativity and from every dimension thereafter, but not at the zeroth dimension. At the zeroth dimension, they're incompatible, and they make divergent, very different subjective values, one of which is a point, the other of which is not a point or an anti-point. It's literally zero. Instead of it being near zero as an infinitesimal, the way a point is, it's actually zero, which means that there is not even a point there. Now, what's weird is when you visualize a point, right? It's a dot. Well, let's say you have a ring of dots, and then in the center of that ring, you have no dots. Is that center of that ring kind of like a dot? I mean, it's not a dot, obviously, because it's hollow, because otherwise it wouldn't be a ring, it'd be a disc. But if you take out that center point and you have an anti-point there, a hole instead of a point, it kind of acts as if it were a point, and it kind of looks as similar to a point, but it isn't a point. It's an anti-point. It's being defined by its externals. It's dependent upon all the points that are around it. Because if you take those points away, then you've just got nothing. And now there is no center of the ring. There's no hole in the center of it. There's just nothing, right? So if you put a ring of points with nothing in the center of that ring, then that becomes different than it was before the ring existed. And we know that. We intuitively, well, at least intuitively, we know that. I think it's intrinsic, though. And that really, I think, is the ultimate essence of, like, if you want to talk about subtle, that's about as subtle as I think I can get, at least presently, is the subtle difference between a point along the ring and that center of that ring that has no point. Those two different things define the difference of all the subjects that are in existence. And it's that location, you see, that makes the difference. And are you on the periphery in the ring of points, actively participating, actively interactive, actively making choices? Or are you in the center where you're defined by that periphery, where you make the choice not to choose, where you say that everything in existence is just rendered that way because of some random chance that it just happened to be this way and I don't have any choice in it. I'm just some hapless victim in existence. That's being in the center of the ring. Now, it's more accurate from the view of the self, but it's less accurate in the view of everybody else, including God. So, yeah, you can, withdraw and fold onto yourself and just crumple yourself like you're a sheet of paper, crumpling yourself into this tiny little speck, or you can unfold and see what's written on there. It's that big of a difference. And of course, there's a third, which is like at the edge in between the point and the center. Technically, that's the eye limit in between the center and the periphery. So that's there too. That's its own independent thing. But the difference between the center and the periphery in that ring of points with the antipoint at the center, that distinction is the distinction between dependence at the center and independence at the periphery. So if you were to define the term independence, that's a demonstration of what it is to be independent, is that you can, as a point, be defined fully without having to depend on any external thing from that to define it. What you could do is you could say that the point is not zero, it's not nothing, it is there. So you are making a reference to nothing, but remember, nothing is nothing, and so it doesn't count as a reference. So when you refer to nothing, you're not actually referring to nothing, because nothing is, again, that center at the center of the ring, except it doesn't even have a ring around it. It's the same center, it's the same anti-point, but it's just not located inside of a ring of points. Nothing is limitless and boundless. It has no boundaries. So when you are in consideration of it, that's why you have to think of a mode or a world. Everything in that mode, everything in that world of nothing depends on stuff that's external to it to define it. It does not depend on itself. So every time I refer to it, I'm referring to its dependence. Excuse me. I'm referring to its... Oh, that's weird. See, I'm going to have to do some work, because the absolute of nothing is best defined by being absolutely independent and absolutely absolutely integrated and absolutely not interactive. versus being is the exact opposite. Being is absolutely dependent, but also absolutely integrated and absolutely interactive. So if being is supposed to represent independence, but yet is itself dependent, how does that work? Being as an absolute is absolutely dependent. Nothing as an absolute is absolutely independent. But as a relativity, as a part of that, as an image of being or an image of nothing, it's flipped. So the image of nothing is dependent on nothing, which is absolutely independent. The image of being, the point, is independent of the center, and that center is dependent on nothing, and nothing is absolutely independent. And being as an absolute is dependent upon nothing. So I know that this is confusing, but it does make sense. It's just extremely subtle. It takes a lot of getting used to. You got to do it a lot. These mental gymnastics are rough. But the reason that I have the choice, the reason that I have the capacity and the depth, is because of the distinction between the center of a ring of points and each of those points in that ring, all being distinct from each other. Each point in the ring is distinct from every other point in the ring due to its relativistic different distance from every other point in that ring. And every point in that ring is also distinct and independent from the center. So the capacity to make a choice is because every time that I have a point, even if I have one point, the center of that point is hollow, and yet the periphery of it is not zero. It's not nothing. It has a non-zero periphery, but it has a zero center, because there's no center point of a center point. There's nothing at the center of a point. The point is so infinitesimally small that there isn't room for there to be anything at the center. And then the volume is the difference between nothing and that infinitesimal surface area at the periphery of the point. So even in the point, it still has those same relations. So the reason that I have a choice is because there's no center to a point. In other words, if you were to reduce everything to a point, you would still have the distinction, the room, the width, the gap in between the edge of that point and the center of that point. And they would have to be different, because otherwise the point doesn't exist, because it would be zero depth. It would have zero depth. There would not be any depth to it. So because a point has to have non-zero depth in order to extend at least infinitesimally into space so that I can actually draw it on a whiteboard, it takes up some space. So that if I were to draw an infinite number of points, I would have to have a line. I would not ever be able to end up with another point after I had an infinite number of points. So by knowing all those relations about points, what that means is that if we were to reduce everything down to a singularity, we would still have choice, because even that singularity isn't solid. There's a hollowness to it. There's a hole at the center. And because there's also volume just outside that center that connects that center of nothing to the periphery of being through the volume of I, indiscernibility, then there must be the indiscernibility of the infinitesimal in the volume and the discernibility of that infinitesimal at the surface area exterior, which is what we think of when we think of a point. If that point were solid, so that it was impossible to tell the difference between the very edge of its periphery and its center, and in which case the outside edge and the inside center would be touching, and they would be indiscernible from each other, at which point the point would not exist because it wouldn't extend into space. It would be like if I shrunk you down to where the top of your head touched the bottom of your feet, then you wouldn't exist. You would have no height at all. You would be squashed into oblivion because the top of your head fitting the bottom of your feet means that there's not even a super infinitely dense mass. There's not even room for that. There's no marble at the end. There's just nothing. And so because of that, we have a choice. Because of the impossibility of the periphery of anything being identical to its center, even if we compressed it to its absolute possible limit, it still wouldn't be condensed enough to become nothing. Therefore, we have a room for choice. Therefore, we have a distance to travel. We can go from the center of that point to the volume of that point to the periphery of that point, and all three of those locations are different. And math lines up with this because when you divide 0 by 0, you get 3 answers, not 1. Like you would normally only ever get 1 answer in math, right? Well, in this case, you always get 3. You get 0, 1, and infinity, the 3 absolutes, the 3 absolute values in math, 0, 1, and infinity. And every single number can be defined by those 3 numbers. And all 3 of those numbers are necessary in order to give every number its distinct value. So, if we try to reduce everything in existence to determinism, where we don't have any choices, and we've reduced everything down to less than 3, I would say, independent paths that we could take, choices. And we got rid of those, and all we have is just one state, which is the singularity, where the periphery is the same thing as the center, is the same thing as the volume, and all of them squash together into nothing, and then we have nothing. So since we don't have nothing now, and since nothing is impossible, for reasons that I haven't disclosed in this one, but I'll do that later, then we must have choice. So that's where choice comes from. And that's where we come from. And that's ultimately what we are. And that's the explanation of why we exist, is because there has to be a distance between the center, the volume, and the periphery of anything. Even a point has a center, a volume, and a periphery. And they have to be independent and distinct. You cannot show me a point whose center is indiscernible from its periphery. And you cannot show me a point that has a periphery but has no volume and no center. Because I guarantee you, any periphery that you draw me always must have a center. If it's a contiguous periphery, it has a center. So just because it's infinitesimally small doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means that it's very, 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 very small. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. If it didn't exist, you wouldn't be able to draw it. You wouldn't be able to point to it. You wouldn't be able to talk about it. It wouldn't be there. Or it would just be like nothing. And it isn't. So therefore, we have a choice.